be seated. So last week we heard the parable about the sower who sowed seeds amongst various soils, and I argued that in this, God appears to be this excessive sower who is not the best steward of the seeds because the seeds are going just about everywhere. When I offered this sermon, I offered that the parable had probably layers of meaning, and that what the crowd heard would have been one thing, and what the disciples heard with Cliff Notes offered was probably something different. And so we carry on today with the continuation of a bunch of parables. This is the first of a few that start out with the kingdom of heaven is like. So I want to look at it again from the perspective of what is the crowd probably hearing here, and then what are the disciples hearing once they are given the Cliff Notes afterwards. So we have the crowd, and they hear the kingdom of heaven. So I would propose that part of this is this idea that already we are in the midst of the kingdom of heaven, that this might have been what the crowd was hearing, that they were in the midst of chaos. They were in the midst of their own sense of weeds growing up. They were under Roman occupation. Many of them were struggling to live from day to day. Many of them were oppressed also by their religious leaders. Life was not easy for this crowd of people, and yet here they hear these words about weeds growing up in the midst of the weeds. And I'm sure that they could probably identify with that a bit. They might identify a bit with this sense of also some coming in and sabotaging, some type of betrayal happening. And so while they're hearing this, there's this reality check, this recognizing that even though they are in the midst of chaos, even now they are in the midst of the kingdom of heaven. And so some, when they hear about the chaos, when they see the chaos around them, these weeds growing up, I'm sure they ask, where is God in the midst of this? And others might even ask, why is God not just coming and wiping it all out? Why isn't God doing a factory reset, starting over from scratch, because this experiment is clearly not working as it's meant to? And so while some probably had these types of thoughts, this parable offers hope, saying, God is truly in control. You may be noticing the weeds right now, and it may be a struggle, but this is not the end of the story. God knows what's going on. God is working. God has an ultimate plan. So hold on, hold tight, for this is not the end. And that hopefully brought comfort to some in the crowd who were feeling like they were being strangled by weeds, to know that God truly is active and that God has a plan, that this is not the end. And then we have what the disciples might have understood from this parable. First, they might have understood this idea that they are not to be the ones who judge. The angels come in and do the reaping, the separating of the wheat and the weeds, not the disciples. And so they probably heard that as, slow down, don't be too hasty, don't judge everyone. Good message. But with that, I almost wonder if at first there might be this sense of, okay, where do the disciples get involved with anything in this parable? It almost seems like the disciples are just supposed to sit back and do nothing. But as we've seen throughout the scriptures, the disciples are not called to sit back and simply wait. They've already been called in Matthew's gospel to go out 2 by 2 to spread the good news. That's anything but waiting. Now, I've had to do a little bit of research because A, I'm not a farmer today, let alone what it was like to be a farmer 2,000 years ago. Apparently, it's actually rather common to have someone come in and sabotage your field. If you had an abundant harvest, that meant more money for you. If you don't have a good harvest, that means the demand for that goes up, which means the field next door that had the good harvest is going to get paid more. So it was not uncommon to do some shady things to promote your business while pushing down others. And so with that, it also was not uncommon. It was regular practice to make sure that some of the hired hands of that field stayed awake at night to watch, to make sure that no villains came in, no saboteurs came to destroy your harvest. In our parable today, we heard that everyone was sleeping, and that is when the saboteur came. So I wonder if one of the messages that the disciples might have heard was a message to keep watch, to stay awake, to raise the alarm when they notice something horrible happening. Now, on one hand, they're being told not to judge the wheat from the weeds, and on the other hand, they're being called to keep watch. Well, how do you keep watch if you don't know what's good and what's bad? So as I'm pondering through this possible paradox in my head this week, I came up with the idea that maybe we're not called to call out individuals, but we are called to call out systems and structures. We're called to call out general behaviors and societal norms that bring harm, that bring destruction, that lead to death, not life. And so we're not to demonize an individual, but we are also not to normalize toxic behaviors. How do we do that with grace and kindness, to respect all individuals as children of God, and yet not always allow certain behaviors, certain structures and systems? What do we keep watch for? The other thing I think the disciples heard is this call to bear good fruit themselves. So darnel, the weed, or what is most likely assumed as the weed in this, it's a plant that as it grows up looks just like wheat. The only time that you can tell the difference is once the grain starts to appear, the later stages of the plant's life. So wheat has this golden hue, it's fluffy, it looks lovely, right? But darnel, as it comes to its last stages, it doesn't have this golden hued grain. It's kind of dark and icky looking, kind of bleh. And to see images that I don't even know how to explain it, just not very pleasant looking. And so that point is the point where you can tell the difference between the wheat and the weeds. It's because of the fruit it produces. John's gospel says, "You will know they are Christians by my love." Matthew doesn't have a nice pithy way of saying, "You will know the fruit. You will know that this is good fruit by X, Y, or Z." But what it does have are the Beatitudes. So Matthew says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are. Those things that are listed are some of the examples of the fruit. And then the woes are the ones to look out for. I think there's this reminder that we are to be aware of the fruit that we are producing or not producing. So again, I know nothing about farming, know nothing about plants. So forgive me if I'm completely wrong on this, but I did do a little research this week on what darnel is. And most scholars will say that darnel is this poisonous plant. But once I did a little bit more research, I discovered that darnel itself is actually not poisonous. The plant itself is not as malicious as we would think from reading today's parable. It's actually a fungus that grows within the plant that makes it poisonous, that makes it completely undesirable to have as part of your harvest. So this fungus and darnel have this symbiotic relationship. Darnel by itself is this kind of weakling of a plant, does not survive really well on its own, but when the fungus comes, the fungus actually helps darnel, at least in the short run. So the fungus produces this toxin that keeps away pests, that keeps away any animals from grazing on it while it is trying to grow. And then in response, the darnel provides a place for this fungus to grow protected. The fungus actually grows from inside the shoot of the grain and inside the seed itself. And so it's this seemingly mutually beneficial relationship between the fungus and the darnel. In fact, though, the darnel, but the fact is that the darnel can grow, can survive without the fungus. It's just not as common. So keeping that in mind, I can't help but wonder if maybe part of this parable is the landowner knowing that darnel is not always fully bad. That even darnel has this hope of being something redeemable. It says, not all darnel grows up to be poisonous. I think humans are not inherently bad. We're not inherently evil. But it's when we become infested, so to speak, when this fungus comes to take up residency within us, that we lose our connection with who God created us to be. And that's where death is found. That's where destruction is found. So how do we, as a community, recognize that it's often those who are most vulnerable, the weaker darnel, who are more susceptible to these seemingly symbiotic relationships, but actually lead to death and destruction? How do we make sure that that fungus does not infest? How do we make sure within ourselves we do not allow the fungus to grow? One of the interesting things is that the fungus, like I said, lives actually within the seed. And really hard then to get rid of the fungus once it's there. It goes from one generation of the plant to the next to the next. But even there is hope. If you take the seed and you tuck it away for 2 to 3 years, you remove all of the things that fungus likes to live on, moisture and light. If you tuck it away, the fungus will die, and a darnel can grow as it is meant to grow. The end of our reading today has a not so pleasant image, weeping and gnashing of teeth. Matthew, the gospel writer, likes to often speak in hyperbole. All of this is good, all of this is bad, divide everything up, lots of weeping and gnashing of teeth. And yet, I think when we take a step back and look at the Gospels as a whole, we see that nothing is as black and white as it appears. And so even here, even in Matthew's Gospel with this imagery of weeping and gnashing of teeth, there's actually a glimmer of hope. So farmers don't like to waste anything. So when they burn a crop, they don't just leave the ashes there to remain. They take the ashes then and they mix it up with the fertilizer, because ashes actually have a lot of important vital nutrients. And so even those ashes become a key building block for the next generation of growth. There's things that need to get burned away. But even there, death does not get the last word. Our God is a God of life, and life always finds a way to have the last word. Amen.